Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You may be seated. The Executive Dean, Faculty of Health Sciences, Professor André Swart, Professor Babs Surichlal, our respondent for the evening from the University of Northwest, Professor Wim Hollander, our keynote speaker for this evening, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. It's indeed my pleasure and privilege to welcome you all on this auspicious occasion for the University of Johannesburg, the professorial inauguration of Professor Hollander, Professor in Sports Management from the Faculty of Health Sciences. In particular, I'd like to welcome Professor Hollander's wife, daughters I should say, and other members of the family. It's a great pleasure indeed to have you up with us on this occasion, and I'm sure it's also a very proud moment for each and every one of you. May I also take this opportunity to welcome colleagues from our sister universities and from business and industry, as well as a warm welcome to members of our executive leadership group. I'd like to single out Professor Mr. Jacob van Schoor, who is our Deputy Vice Chancellor of Finance here, and also the Vice Dean of the Faculty of Health Sciences, heads of departments, other academics and students. Ladies and gentlemen, I think I've covered everyone. You're all most welcome. A professorial inauguration such as the one we're going to be participating in this evening is a truly significant occasion in the life of a university as an institution of learning and scholarship. It represents the formal induction of a senior member of the faculty into the ranks of the academic professoriate. The term professor derives from the verb to profess, and the origins of to profess derive originally from Latin. Thus, the original Roman meaning is to confess before the public. In the late Middle Ages, the term professor was used to refer to university teachers of the highest order. While the act was no longer a confession, rather a declaration and exposition of one's academic disciplines, the very public nature of the event remains entrenched. It is, and always has been, the opportunity for an eminent scholar to explain the principles, procedures, and objects of one's scholarly gaze to one's peers, members of the public, and to one's family. It's the one time when the family may quite understand what one has been studying for all these years. The act of professing was a prelude to the conferring of the title of professor, a title that's been conferred on very few and requires that one was famous for one's work, acknowledged amongst the universities at that time of Europe, and being preeminent in one's particular field of inquiry. This elite group comprised the Senate, and because medieval universities were communities, the towns in which they were situated were essentially extensions of the university providing civil service. The Senate, therefore, largely controlled the towns. Fortunately, modern-day professors do not have to function as city councillors. But there's more to the history of the professor. Professors frequently hold chairs in their disciplines. The medieval origin of the chair derives from Islam. The Caliph, as was known then, would appoint what we call a kursi, or a chair, in a university or a madrasa. The appointment was normally for life, and the chairholder, the kursi, would sit literally in a chair surrounded by students. The kursi, like the professor, was highly esteemed, and for good reasons. Perhaps the most shining example of Islamic learning in Africa was the establishment of the University of Timbuktu in Mali in the 12th century. Centuries ago, this seat of learning had 25,000 students from Africa and the Mediterranean. So from two distinct medieval traditions, one steeped in Islam and the other steeped in Christianity, an outstanding academic elite was established. The situation is no different today. As a leading institute of higher learning, the University of Johannesburg goes to great lengths to make professorial appointments that will ensure the status and quality of the university is maintained for generations to come. Our professors are truly significant members of our university. As members of Senate, they guide our decision-making around core academic activities. They represent their disciplines both within and outside the university, in academic contexts, and in broader professional and social contexts. They offer academic support and leadership. They are responsible for nurturing young faculty and supporting them as they mature into the next generation of scholars. And they ensure that we offer our students a quality learning experience. But all of this, of course, requires qualities additional to the erudition, which we primarily associate with being a professor. It also requires professors and academic leaders who also show a human face, who combine academic leadership with concern and care for their colleagues and students. And we know these are the qualities that Professor Hollander is well known for. On that short introductory remarks, I'd like to turn to Professor Hollander and say, sir, we look forward to your presentation this evening. I'm most intrigued by your title. It's absolutely fascinating, and I'm certainly looking forward to your address this evening. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I now call upon the Executive Dean to introduce Professor Hollander.
Thank you, Professor Parek. Let me also echo a warm welcome to everybody here tonight. And let me also take this opportunity to extend a special word of welcome to Professor Hollander, and we really look forward to your lecture here tonight to us. Ladies and gentlemen, it's indeed my pleasure to introduce Wim Hollander to you all. Willem Johannes, as we know him, Wim Hollander, was born in 1957 in Nelspruit, Mpumalanga, where he matriculated in Hoërskool Nelspruit in 1974. He obtained a BSc in Botany and Zoology, postgraduate teacher's diploma, a B.Ed in school management, which he achieved cum laude, a M.Ed and D.Ed in teaching science, and a D.Com in sport management at the former Rand Afrikaans University, now the University of Johannesburg. Wim is married to Mitzi, has 6 children, a daughter and a son, 2 stepdaughters, 2 sons-in-law, and a grandson, Rico. He started his career in 1991 as a biology teacher at Hoërskool die Adelaar in Roodepoort, Johannesburg, and 2 years later accepted a position, listen to this ladies and gentlemen, as a technical worker in the Faculty of Education, Department of Teaching Science at the University of Johannesburg, then RAU, where he managed the didactical laboratory, a laboratory where teachers were trained in teaching competencies. Wim was promoted to senior lecturer in the same department after completing his D.Ed, already lecturing teaching science, curriculum studies, subject didactics, biology, and media studies. In 1993, Wim was requested to join the Department of Sport and Movement Studies in the Faculty of Management and Economic Sciences as associate professor, where he was instrumental in the further development of the first sport management program in South Africa and Africa. He completed his second doctorate in sport management in 2000 and became professor in the same field. Wim became chairperson of the Department of Sport and Movement Studies in 1999 and simultaneously chief director of sport in 2001 to strategically position the academic programs as well as practical components of sport in the university and the South African sport industry. This continued after the merger of the Rand Afrikaans University with Technikon Witwatersrand and Vista University in 2005, until 2007, after which the joint appointment was discontinued and he remained in the position of Executive Director Sport until 2012. He returned to the Department of Sport and Movement Studies in 2013 as Professor in Sport Management in the Faculty of Health Sciences, where he is heading up the Sport Management Program and coordinating the Honours Program in the same field of study. During his 34 years of employment at the University of Johannesburg in different academic and support environments, Wim supervised 21 Masters and 3 PhD studies, acted as undergraduate moderator for 7 universities and external examiner of 13 master dissertations and PhD theses. He has further published 31 peer-reviewed articles, contributed to 9 chapters in books and 4 training manuals. He further presented peer-reviewed papers at 19 national and 24 international conferences and offered multiple presentations in local and national government and private institutions. In 2007, Wim jointly received the Sport Information Resources Centre Africa Research Award in the category Community Research for the development of the management component of the Sport in Development Impact Assessment tool, as well as research undertaken in this field. Research resulted in 40 national and international reports for organizations such as Sport and Recreation South Africa, South African Sport Confederation and Olympic Committee, England Sport, Australian Sports Commission, Coca-Cola Africa Foundation, SAPI Foundation, Vodacom Foundation, APSA CSI and Nike Africa. Other awards received are the Joe Pullman Trophy, an academic prize for sport participants at RAU in 1981, Merit Medal from the RAU Sport Council in 1995, Service Medal from the RAU Student Council in 1995, and Coaching Award from the Gauteng Lions Coaching Association in 1997. Wim served on various boards such as the RAU Kaiser Chiefs Soccer School of Excellence, University Sport Company, and the Wit Center for Exercise Science and Sport Medicine at the University of the Witwatersrand. He is one of only 3 members of an international independent committee allocating, monitoring, and evaluating implementation of development funds for the Commonwealth Games Federation. Lastly, Wim has been actively involved in rugby. This includes, among others, playing for South Eastern Transvaal, now known as the Pumas, Cravenwick, Transvaal Under-20, and Senior Currie Cup teams. He also coached the Transvaal Lions Under-20 and Under-21 teams, South African Universities Under-20, South African Universities Under-21, and the Lions Senior Currie Cup teams. On management level, he was a selector of the Transvaal Under-20 and Under-21 teams, manager of the Transvaal Under-20, Under-21, and SA Under-20 University and South African Under-21 rugby teams. He was also convener of the Transvaal Under-20, Under-21, and SA Under-20 and U21's University Selection Committee. Ladies and gentlemen, Prof Hollander will now entertain and I'm sure enlighten us, as Prof Parek has alluded, with his interesting presentation entitled, Can You Fly the Spaceship, Captain Kirk? Prof Hollander, over to you.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a privilege to do this lecture tonight. I would like to thank Prof Parek for leading the entourage tonight. Thank you for being here, for making time to be here. Also to Prof Swart, thank you for the reading of my curriculum vitae. And then Prof Babs Surajal. Now Prof Babs is actually one of the PhD students that I supervised. Prof Babs, I just want to tell you that I told some of the students this week that you will be here and that you used some of your research last year for the research assignment. So this is Prof Babs Surajal. I would also like to thank my family for being here tonight, for the support, Mitzi. Academics will know you go on your own boat and you sail on your own. No, Norman. And sometimes it's rough sea, and you try to figure out what do you want to say. And I said to Mitzi, I need a nice title. I need a nice title. And I got up this morning and I said to her, I've got it. How does this sound? Can you fly the spaceship, Captain? And I couldn't remember the name. So I had to Google, and I came to the conclusion I had the wrong name. And I thought, well, let's see whether one can maneuver within this title, because management is one of those fields, Jaco, that one could move around quite easily and build your argument. So what I'm going to do tonight is I will start off with the introduction, introduce the younger age, most probably the youngest one, to Captain Kirk. Who is Captain Kirk really, and what has he done and what is he still doing, and looking at the context of this presentation. Then I will inform you a little bit on the systems theory, the systems theory is. That forms the background and the backdrop of the presentation, and provide the context in which I prepared this presentation. Then I would look at commercialization in sport, the development of commercialization, the impact of commercialization in the sport environment. I'll be looking at globalization, and I'll be looking at professionalization. These are three major trends that impacted and is still impacting on sport. And it would be interesting for you to learn that most of these things started happening in the late 70s, after 1976. Now for the younger ones amongst you, the students, it might feel it's quite far back. But for the older ones like me and I won't name, it feels like yesterday. Under professionalization, we're looking at migration of people, historically marginalized groups. I'll look at sport for development, and then look at implications for leaders in sport, and lastly, I will conclude. Now, ladies and gentlemen, Star Trek is a science fiction television series that started in 1966. Last year, they celebrated their 50th year of existence. Captain Kirk is a crew, and his crew, starship USS Enterprise. They're exploring the unknown, the galaxy in the 23rd millennium. He's a commanding and a decisive leader, and he makes split-moment decisions. So Captain Kirk is a person that is leading a group of people in the unknown, in an environment where they don't know what will follow, what is the next that will happen. Over 50 years, they also published, or they also launched 13 movies, of which last year, Beyond, was the 13th one, which formed part of the celebration movies. Now, if you think of this, Star Trek being in the business environment for 50 years, and 11 years after they started with their programming and business, Star Wars started as competition. And so they started in 1977, and Star Trek, apparently they called people following the Trekkies. So I hope after tonight you're rather a Trekkie than a Star Warie. So the question is, how did they sustain? How did they manage their sustainability and their competitiveness over 40 years? You will see that from these titles, such as Generations, Contact, Insurrection, and others, that these titles refer to the unknown, refer to explorations of an understanding of the new. But what is interesting is that they focused on the real issues of mankind, and they focused in all these episodes, and they focused in all these movies on things such as race, colonialization, substance abuse, right to life and death. And all these themes intrigued people, and people are still watching these episodes. So what is the relevance of this? The relevance is that any business, that any organization should stay abreast with new developments, should understand what the unknown is, and even what the known is, in order to change accordingly. So if you look at the systems theory, now the systems theory is a semantic divide or a differentiation between the external, the environment, and the internal, the organization. So if we look at the internal part of the organization, we find different non-linear systems, or systems behavior is non-linear. It is many degrees of freedom. You can change it. It interacts with the environment, and there's a constant flux between the environment and the internal part, the systems and the subsystems. And in order to stay effective and efficient in the organization, the environment dictates to a great extent what is happening in the inside. So if the environment changes, then the system within and the subsystems within the organization will change. And if there's no change within the system, you would find that the organization would stop. Existence of the organization would then stop. Now, systems and subsystems are human resources, would be a strategic imperative of the organization, would be the finances, would be the management activities, governance, would be operations and technology of the organizations. So these systems and subsystems coherently function in order to obtain the strategy and the aims and objectives of the organization. Therefore, I would like tonight to look a little bit at these environmental variables to see how has commercialization, globalization, and professionalization changed the environment and is still changing the environment. And how can we link Captain Kirk with this changing environment? So when you look at commercialization, commercialization was the catalyst of commercialization. Took place in the late 70s, 76, 78 to 80s, when the deregulation and ownership of television channels came to the fore. This provided an opportunity for further development of technology, satellite broadcasting and digitizing, and the establishment of subscription television. So three major television companies came to the fore. ESPN in America, Canal Plus in France, and then Sky Sports in the central of Britain and in Ireland. Now at this point in time, sport was a source, was an opportunity for publicity, because nobody were interested at that point to sponsor sport, to get involved in sport. But suddenly there was an opportunity for broadcasting rights, for naming rights, for sponsorships, and for advertising and increased advertising. So there was an access to funds, and suddenly the sports structures and sports organizations were in a position to say, well, this is my price. This is what I require. Today, with the new introduction of social media, provided a shift to demassification, miniaturization and portability, and a change from a one-way to a transactional communication. So we have another wave of media that is to the use of your sports environments. And suddenly, when we see the marketing of the different organizations, we see sort of a cluttering in the marketing on the clothing of athletes, on stands, on stages, etc., etc. Interesting to know that one of the events where no marketing material is allowed is at Wimbledon. At Wimbledon, it's a clear stadium, no marketing material. Even the players are not allowed to wear clothes with logos on. So commercialization took off, and there was then a lot of money. And suddenly, these sports organizations had money. Now, I just want to take you back to 1994 with the World Cup, rugby. 1994 was the change from amateur to professional rugby in the world. And it was because of Sky Sports that tried to, after the World Cup, brought together all the captains of the World Cup teams and tried to instill and start a global competition with rugby players. And that is when the Southern Hemisphere decided no, they won't be going that way, and that's when they started with the money from Sky Sports. They started the Super Rugby that you see on television today. So, sports clubs ran into sustainability challenges. They were amateur driven. Athletes were participating for participation and competition. There were different value propositions, and the challenge became, because money came in Europe, football, the focus was play for the game, play for winning, whereby your non-traditional sport participate in sport obviously for a profit. So suddenly you had this value proposition challenge within the sports organizations, a lot of money, lack of financial governance, and bankruptcy. To such an extent that in Italy, over 6 years, the increase in players' salary was 700%. And in 2000-2001, the season loss of, listen closely, 982.2 euro. 982 million euro. In Europe, 32 of the clubs were in negative net equity. Loans were up to 5.5 billion euro. And in South Africa, last year, we know of 3 provincial structures that were liquidated. So this is a constant thing that is happening. And sport is not out of that position yet. So cost to remain competitive, athletes became much more expensive. They wanted to play for 5-6 years and then go on pension. So there was this debate and this challenge, and our own François Pinault led the entourage. And because of this negotiation and interaction, Dr. Louis Leite had to manage that. You will most probably remember that all the players received R1 million to not go abroad and to stay within South Africa and play for the South African teams and for the Springboks. One player was not part of the, which I won't name, was not part of the team, of the World Cup team, that also received R1 million because he was also involved in the negotiations. So the cost to remain competitive, the loss of competitive balance. So what happened then is different sport clubs could negotiate at bigger, sponsorships and contracts, and the smaller clubs couldn't negotiate that, and suddenly you had, and the bigger clubs could afford better players, and you then got a loss of balance, and you see it in the Super Rugby now. The normal process is to grow your competition until you get to that position where you have an imbalance of your competition, and then you have to shrink your competition again in order to still have that competitive level to draw your spectators and supporters. Because if there's a mismatch, spectators won't attend. And then fan exploitation started, and asking huge amounts for clothing to make a bigger profit in order to afford the participants. Commercialization related social ills came in, match fixing, use of performance enhancing substances, hooliganism of supporters. We all know of that. I would like to talk on the next topic, globalization. There are two definitions of globalization, but just look at this little man there, what he's doing. He's painting the whole world in red. So it's a worldwide link with happenings in distant localities that shape local activities and vice versa. Meaning that things happen that organizations see or companies see, they duplicate that process in locally, but what is happening locally is also happening there. So you have this this exchange of information. Now sport is an interesting environment because sport was structured from a national structure from an international structure to a local structure with the same rules, with the same regulations. So it was easy to globalize. But through the whole globalization process, you would see that there are similar things that they do. You look at the high performance programs they do, you look at the management structures, you look at governance systems, you will see a global approach. Another definition is a worldwide movement towards economic, financial, communication and social integration that links to what we will see just later. But here you see this is an example of globalization. National Football League is global, and they have global supporters, and they do their marketing on a global level. But this is another interesting one. Tochakuka is the Chinese word for global localization. Now, this is a little bit different from just globalization. So what is global localization? Well, you can measure it by using these two. The reach of globalization could be on a micro, meso, and a macro level, which I'll come back to now, and then the response of the organization towards globalization, so from resistance to uniqueness to acceptance. Now, on the micro level, is global localization, I would think, would be the use of sports equipment, the use of technology to prepare your athletes. So that is most probably then the acceptance of globalization, and that is on the micro level. So it's on the individual level. So we see a lot of people walking with Nike clothing, we see people using specific shoes, etc., etc. But if you look on the meso level, that would be on a national level. Now here we see the Israeli team. The Israeli team is positioned sport-wise in Asia, but they participate in Europe. And they have, you can see the clothes, there's a lot of America in this. So there's some Americanization. And what they have done is they even have American athletes. So what they do is they build a unique system and a structure on the macro level, and they have certain values, team values, etc., etc., but they also inherited some American stuff. But they were then playing in Europe. So that's one example. A South African example is the Varsity Cup and the NCAA. So this Varsity Cup is based on the American product of student sport. By the way, one of the biggest organizations in America in sport is the NCAA. So if you go to a Varsity Cup event, you will see the vibe, you will see the dancing girls, you will see a program, you will see running out of the tunnel, you will see the students cheering on, bringing people together and building a brand through the Varsity Cup and the NCAA. But then you need to decide as an organization where strategically, where do you want to position yourself within the context of globalization. What is your resistance? Is there resistance? Is it mere acceptance? Or is there a uniqueness that you want to build utilizing other cultures, other systems and structures? But then there's another one. No, before we get there. This is Beijing Olympics, but the Chinese, what they did is they went through a process of relationship with the IOC, International Olympic Committee. So they were in a phase of withdrawal and rejection. They demonstrated their superiority with USSR and pushes the socialism, and to show the world they were part of the Olympics, to show that the social approach is the superior approach, and therefore they have a lot of medals and they perform. But later they went through a process of partial re-engagement. This relationship broke down. They had a partial re-engagement, and the whole issue was the two Chinas. And then they decided to become enthusiastic involved. And what they decided is they would use global ideas in sport and athlete development. They regenerated their whole sports environment on a social concept, on socialism. But they utilized athlete development, they utilized the management, the structures of the world, and then after they've done that and prepared their athletes, prepared their policies, they engaged with the Olympic Committee and then offered the Beijing 2008. Now that is an example of macro level uniqueness in glocalization. Let's go to the next one. That's another word. It's globalization. Now globalization, remember that little guy that was painting the globe? That is what globalization is. Now they talk here about McDonaldization, they're talking about Disneyfication, and they're talking about mass martification. That is globalization. It's a focus on imperialistic goals, desires and needs to secure supremacy and optimal growth. It's really taking over. We know this shop. That's the Americans. We know this shop. That's also the Americans. Right, and we know this one, most probably on television or in the movie houses. But globalization is when you accept you could be exposed to globalization. And within the context of the systems theory, going back to the systems theory, you need to understand what your strategic systems are and how do you negotiate your strategic systems in order to sustain development but also to stay unique. So the next one is professionalization. Yeah, I wanted Mr. Sam to be on the picture. He was invited here. But so what happened from commercialization, from globalization, suddenly you had a situation where your sports structures sat with money. They had athletes, professional athletes, or they had to pay the athletes, and there were these global events to participate in. Suddenly the countries started engaging and governments started engage with this whole process because countries can't lose. We need medals, so we drive the medal count, because if you have more medals, you're a better country. So being perceived. So what happened to the sports structures? So a coercive pressure from both inside and outside sport organizations happened. So governments, national sports federations, this is now national structures, sports structures, sponsors, they put pressure on the structures for better governance because they putting money into this whole process from a management perspective. So they want feedback, they need information, they need governance. An increased differentiation of sport happened. So what happened here is different sports started to establish, but in the process of professionalization, everybody was driving the money, yet the bottom of sport, we're talking about social sport, community sport, physical education, dropped out of school, dropped out of community, so there was no delivery of sport. And people started, and I'll talk a little bit later on that, and people, as people are, took initiative and they saw the opportunity to to make money to appoint people. Then major growth of international competition, I've mentioned that. And so you see here that the external pressure was on from government, from sponsors, from everybody onto the sports organizations, yet they were still amateurs. An increase in skills requirements, talking about management skills, boards suddenly, because money is involved, sports structures needed boards, and they didn't have strategic capabilities because boards consisted mainly of amateurs, and is still consisting of amateurs. In the 2014 Commonwealth Games, research that we did, 77% of the presidents and the secretaries of national sports federations were volunteers, and are still volunteers. So out there is a lot of volunteers doing business, yet most of them obtain their position on these boards because of being in the system for so long. A volunteer mindset, I've talked about that. Then conflict between board CEOs and coaches is happening. We hear it on a daily basis. You would hear people would say, fire the coach. You would hear people say, the team is unfit. Or they would say, get a selection committee. Because of this conflict, because you suddenly get professionals moving in from the bottom, the coaches, the administrators, but your board still sit there, and the decision making of the board is still a contentious issue. Is the role of the board to be involved in strategic direction? Is the board involved just to govern? What are the processes required by whom? And then a strengthening of managerialism and efficiency-based management instruments is now the order of the day. Furthermore, in professionalization, if you can't read it, it says, yes, I did go to Specsavers in Kenilworth for the umpire. So career opportunities for athletes, coaches, administrators, technical officials, development of career education and training programs. UJ is one of those institutions offering sport management, sport communication, etc., etc., etc. And then professionalization of sports careers. So you suddenly get athletes, you get coaches that become professional and being trained professionally. This instigated migration. Migration of athletes. Yeah, you see, compete at other events during the year, and then when they participate for the country, they would go back. I'll show you on the next slide. And here you see some sort of advert, how to move to Canada as self-employed, either artist or a farmer or an athlete. Research that was done on the typology of migrants. There are different reasons why migrants move. And we should take cognizance of this in a management position. We need to understand, why do athletes move? Mercenaries, settlers, nomadic cosmopolitans, pioneers, returnees, ambitious exiles, and expelled are all the typology or the types of migrants, of athletes that you get. Some of them migrate to move to another country. Some of them go there to be excellent. Some of them go there because they don't get team, or they're not selected in their country. There are different reasons, and then the migrants encounter different experiences of recruitment, of selection, of contracting, induction, and pressures and social stuff. What we find here is that migrants move with the coach, or then the coach will move and will draw the players. A good example is Jake White. He's been all over the world, currently in France, and if his team is running onto the pitch, it's a South African team. The community is not happy with that. There's a lot of debate and discussion about it, but he sort of fired the French players and he brought in South Africans. which is an issue with recruitment and maintenance. Now this is an interesting slide. This is a slide on the majority of World Cup football is played outside home country during regular season. Now this was for the previous FIFA World Cup. Just interesting, you see here Ivory Coast. Now this is a team consists out of 23 players. It's a World Cup team. Look at Ivory Coast, 22 playing outside of Ivory Coast. Ghana, 22. Nigeria, 20. Cameroon, 21. So where do they go? Obviously they go to Europe. None of Russia. You see Australia, 16 of the 22. Through this process, you actually get an opportunity to develop as athlete. So the level of participation increases. But there are challenges because you deplete the local talent pool. And most probably you followed that the SARU, South African Rugby Union, has now declared that only people outside of the current South Africans that currently play outside of South Africa have to have played at least, I think, 35 tests, 30 tests. Which means, what is this challenge? But going back, why do they do it? Well, most probably, the contract that was signed in 1994 for the Super Rugby. And I think there's a clause saying that there are a limited number of players that can play in that competition that are foreign players or playing in foreign countries. So it's a complex environment. So and then the counterproductive to local talent development. Obviously, you deplete your local talent pool. You increase the local talent pool when you recruit people, but people won't continue with the sport, and it's counterproductive. So your athletes will move out. So on average, 14 players of 23 per country were foreign or played outside of the country during the World Cup. 63.5% of the 7 players played outside during season in other clubs. So we see a huge migration of athletes, and this is just one example. If we look at previously marginalized groups, the sport is purported to be social construct that consists of equity, equality, and fairness, and that's definitely not the case. If we look at the EPG report, I think it was released on Tuesday this week, the third one since 2013. We see that some progress with underage and senior race participation was monitored, but membership on boards and medical support and sports science challenges are still a problem. If you look at UK sport, in their reports, they indicate that the minority ethnic men and women are underrepresented in coaching, officiating, administration, and technical support. And those are the 4 fields of work environment. Now, the interesting one is USA. If you look at the NCAA, the student sport, you see a representation of black athletes in football, soccer, and in basketball. But if you read research, the clear message that comes through is that representation, meaning numbers in teams, does not secure eradication of racism. So, not necessarily in the team. In this case, what's happened is stacking of players in position. So what they do is they typically will have 3 players in the same position. You can only play 1 player. So they stack in certain positions players so that the numbers looks good, but it's actually racism. And then also some of the activities within the institution where students don't receive support, like the white students. So the whole NCAA system is a challenge currently commercially, because it became so commercial, although it should be, it's actually an amateur initiative. And I think we need to look at that. And I think this is where our EPG report misses it. So we only look at numbers, and we look at gender and race, but we don't look at the disability in the report, and we don't look at practices, what is happening in the organization. Then gender. Always a big challenge between men and women. Women trying to get to that bar because they're not allowed to do it. You enjoy? All right. Interesting. Lydia Nesikere was the first FIFA executive in 2012 out of 25 executives. FIFA. SAFA, 3 out of 33 executives. If you look at UEFA competition, for the first time, competition for women in 1982, on the same level as for men in Europe. If you look at FIFA World Cup for the first time, 1991. If you look at FIFA under 20, 22, and under 17 in 2008. But look at this. For Bafana to qualify for AFCON in 2012, which they didn't, 20 million. For the Banyana women team qualifying for the 2012 Olympics, which they did, 500,000. Is that equity? Is it? Some further information. For FIFA World Cup winning teams, women received $2 million, the winning team, $2 million. The men team for winning the World Cup, 35 million. In America, USA football salaries, women, a minimum, they should earn a minimum of $6,842. Men, a minimum of 50,000. So we see that from a management perspective, this is a big challenge. And coming back to systems, your human resources systems, is how do you put strategies in place? How do you make sure that there is equity? How do you make sure that your human resources represent the participants in sport? People with disability, we know about the Paralympics, the Commonwealth Games. By the way, next year the Commonwealth Games will host most ever people with disability in the same event in Gold Coast 2018. The development of athletes is a big challenge. Now, historically, where does your Paralympians come from? From war. Yeah. So you will see that those countries where they had war, where they have amputees, will have more Paralympian athletes. And that's traditionally what has happened. So the subsystem of development of athletes, people with disability, is a big challenge. Because there's no policy in place, there's no knowledge, there are no people to provide these services. And youth development programs is currently, I would think, worldwide a challenge. South Africa definitely. There are 2 institutions driving athletes with disability. It's this institution in rowing, and then Stellenbosch. And they are developing the athletes. So, what are the challenges? Leaders don't have adequate training. Parents fear injury and teasing of their learners, and there is a lack of policy. So the subsystem of feeding into the competition is a challenge worldwide. Then sport for development as a third component. So the origin of this movement of sport for development lies within the lack of sports facilities. It lies within the abolishment of physical education in schools. and the non-delivery of sport in communities. We know of programs that government tried to put in place, the mass participation program, the school sport mass participation program. There was a club development program. Didn't take off. And one of the main reasons, sorry, I'm not leaving. One of the main reasons were that there's a lack of sports facility. The research that we did in schools, secondary schools, in 2007, I think, indicated that approximately 75% of learners at schools, and I'm talking about rural schools in South Africa, participate in sport in open spaces. And when there are sports facilities, a netball court and a soccer field, they're not really maintained. Or, in some cases, to such an extent maintained that they become a challenge. What I mean by that is that, just quickly give you an example, at one of the schools they had a netball court, and where you start off in the middle of the court to play the game. They put a patch of cement there, and when we did the research, we asked them, so do you maintain the facilities? Obviously we don't always believe, but then we walked the property, and they said they had big problems with injuries in the netball court. I said, what are the challenges? They said, no, there are rocks, and so it is a big challenge. I said, do you maintain it? So he says, yes, every day. And we went to the facility. That piece of cement was this high in the air, because every morning they maintained the facility, they swept it. And what happened is all the sand was taken out, and then the rocks came out. So it's also a lack of information. What is maintenance? How do we maintain it? I know Cricket South Africa is busy, yoga with a process. These are the challenges we sit with. So the emergence of sport for development in the late 1900s, because of these are examples of, and then in the early 2000s, United Nations acknowledged sport for development, also supporting the Millennium Development Goals. They utilized their arm as UNICEF to utilize sport as a vehicle for sport for development. And the IOC, the Commonwealth Games Federation, are also engaged now in this whole movement. But there is lately a movement back, taking back sport to where sport should be. And you see that there you find that Barcelona links up with UNICEF, and they use now sport for development as a tool for human and community development, but also for mass participation. Then we find positive youth development, and in South Africa we also see that physical education and the advocates of physical education are trying to bring back physical education in schools or similar activities. Currently we find in South Africa NGOs, non-governmental organizations, that were linked to some of these structures, and these organizations deliver sport in the communities. Obviously they get funds from the global north, and they deliver them sport for that purpose. So we found that professionalization created a gap between mass participation and elite participation, to such an extent that school boys in primary school are contracted these days in sport. Where previously school boys and girls would move through the structures of sport, through club structures into provincial, into national, that does not happen. So you earmarked already at the age of 15, 16 and younger to become this professional participant, which is because of the whole professionalization, globalization opportunity. So when you think and we listen to all of this, the question is, so if Captain Kirk wanted to fly the spaceship, would he be able to do it? What is the known and what is the unknown? What is commercialization? Can I do? Can I manage? Can I cope? What is required? What are the implications? Well, in the first instance, understand the impact of the environment on the organization. Go back to the systems theory and understand your external environment and how that impacts on your internal environment. How does globalization impact on this organization? Strategically position the organization within the global sports industry. You know, we have top athletes. And they participated about 2 weeks in Potch. No broadcasting. Our Olympian and Olympians participate. How is athletics positioning themselves in this global sport industry? 2 weeks later, I saw our athletes running in Europe on the Diamond League competition. So, what are we doing to position our sports structures in the global environment? Develop commercial systems and subsystems to secure sustainable value chain for the organization, sponsors and consumers. We have a group of partners in this whole process, including sport for development and positive youth development. Progressively change from a volunteer to a dynamic professional organization for sustainable performance. Not meaning pay everybody, but be professional in your organization. Be dynamic and be sustainable. But provide for the masses to participate, because that is our lost generation. It's the young people that should participate in sport. No physical education in schools. Just to give you an idea, in Soweto, children can participate in athletics at a day at the school, what we used to call, what was it, inter-house. Then the selected few will go to one event, and then a team will be selected, not from the school. So a maximum of 3 athletic events. Netball and soccer, a maximum of 4 games a year. Is that conducive? Is that what we require? Do we position ourselves in this environment? I don't think so. Then progressively change from a volunteer to and we said that, utilize broadcasting and social media as subsystem opportunity for marketing and communication purposes. The interesting thing and I need to say this, is that your biggest sports, your more attractive sports, obviously get more sponsorships. And your minority sport or your smallest sport struggle with that. But it doesn't mean that you shouldn't try. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't negotiate. There are ways and means to curb this challenge. And then develop strategies for integration of previously marginalized groups. Linking it with mass participation. Linking it on the school level. And let people participate, not from a top to a bottom system and structure, but from a bottom to a top structure. And we progressively see movement in South Africa. So will Captain Kirk be able to navigate this spaceship? Most probably, if he's doing that. In conclusion, the external environment of sport organizations provides both opportunities and threats, spelling mistake, to the systems, there it is, let's see, subsystems and such sustainability of sports organizations. Leaders in sport should, amongst others, respond to environmental factors such as commercialization, globalization and professionalization on the systems and subsystems level of sports organization. If leaders in sport are able to do this, we could proclaim, yes, Captain Kirk can fly the spaceship. Thank you.
the Vice Chancellor, Professor Parak, the Dean of Health Sciences, Professor Andre Swart, the man of the moment, Professor Wim Hollander, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a great pleasure for me to respond to the inaugural address of someone who I hold in great esteem, Professor Wim Hollander. When I looked at him today, how calm and collected and well delivered his talk was, I thought, well, am I going to do as well as he is going to do? I'm going to try. As I listened to his address, I was taken back more than 15 years. It was in March 2000 when I arrived at his office and I placed a 2-page proposal on his desk and told him that I wanted to research the training and development of sports coaches in South Africa. I was not prepared for the barrage of questions that followed. So when I look at him calm and collected here and I go back 15 years, I recall how nervous I was in that room. I was like an inexperienced boxer who was being pummeled to the corner of the ring each time. And each time I tried to squirm my way out, I couldn't box my way out. Definitely not. Another barrage of questions came in my direction. When I look at that experience, I look at it in a positive light. Because I walked out of that room stronger, wiser, and more determined, with 3 questions that were ringing in my ears. Why? So what? And how? And when I think about these questions are also evident in his address, where he looked at key issues in the sport industry in South Africa. Just as Professor Parak as well as Professor Swart alluded to his interesting analogy that he used as Captain Kirk to take us through his research journey on the predictable and unpredictable nature and future of sports in South Africa. Similar to Captain Kirk, sports managers and leaders in South Africa face endless dilemmas and challenges on a daily basis. Just as space lends itself to numerous opportunities and possibilities, so does sport. So using the systems theory as a point of departure to explain the opportunities and challenges in sport, Professor Hollander has identified a number of salient challenges and opportunities that sport leaders need to consider. He emphasized the importance of systems and subsystems working together in synergy for the execution of the strategic objectives of a sport organization. Professor Hollander argues that a critical examination of the different systems and subsystems that exist in the sport industry is key to understanding the factors which contribute to our successes and failures. Critical to the sustainability and success of any sport organization, or any organization for that matter, is the efficient and effective leadership to which Professor Hollander alluded. He has provided an in-depth discussion on 3 important areas, namely commercialization, globalization, and professionalization, which warrant astute and competent leadership because of the challenges associated with them. The commercialization of sport has seen the injection of millions of rands, but as Professor Hollander rightfully pointed out, the regulation of revenues as well as the socially induced ills such as match fixing, substance use to enhance performance, and violent behavior of players and fans, to name a few, justify the importance of good leadership and sober leadership to address these issues in sport. Professor Hollander also explained how globalization impacts sports organizations politically, economically, and culturally, and the need for sport leaders to respond to these factors. Globalization is a process by which the world is increasingly becoming interconnected. This is evident in the proliferation of the number of mega sport events in this country. He described the evolution of sport, which was once amateur-oriented, to one which is professional-oriented. He enlightened us on the importance for sport organizations to operate in a business-like manner to achieve its strategic objectives, taking into account limited resources such as financial and human. Professor Hollander also clarified how professionalization of sport has resulted in the migration of professional athletes and coaches and the managerial challenges associated with such movement. A very important aspect of his presentation was on previously marginalized groups. In order for sport leaders to ensure equity, equality, and fairness in sport, they need to consider race, gender, and persons with disabilities. And he did touch on the Paralympics. I looked at two of the leading newspapers, circulation-wise in South Africa, and looked at the coverage of the Paralympics. One of those newspapers on one day had nothing to say about the Paralympics. And that actually is cause for concern because of the number of athletes that take part, as well as the millions of rands injected for such competitions. Professor Hollander also emphasized the need for global leadership development, that is, the leaders who have the necessary drive, ethical orientation, and strong business acumen to address the challenges and opportunities identified in his address. In order to do this, sport leaders will need to consider the impact of the external environment on the systems and subsystems in sport organizations. Through his address, Professor Hollander demonstrated a wealth of knowledge and experience of not only the South African sport industry, but the sport industry globally. Given that academics in sport management in South Africa are a minority, his knowledge and experience is invaluable. And I think his students should take note of this. They are very lucky to have him. I congratulate Professor Hollander on a well-researched address, and may he continue to inspire, motivate, and develop his students and peers through his research. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we come to the next part of the formalities, and that's the official robing of our distinguished professor.